Before pharmacokinetics, before dose response curves, before anyone asked, should we maybe check the liver? America had patent medicines, products that were promised to cure everything and were regulated by marketing confidence. Why were they called patent medicines? Maybe because secret, unregulated drug doesn't sell well. If you've ever complained about FDA paperwork, clinical trials, or labeling requirements, this video is about to explain one reason why those things exist. If we think patent, we might think that the drug had been granted government protection for exclusivity, like brand name drugs today. In actuality, the recipes of most 19th century patent medicines were not officially patented. That's because patents require things like ingredient disclosure, reproducibility, actual chemistry. Patent medicine companies said, hard pass. Instead, they used things like trademarks and had secret formulas. And I'm not sure what word you kids are using these days, but I think it's called vibes. You'll get that when I show you some of the advertisements. Again, not too dissimilar from today's drug marketing. Basically, the drug development pipeline was, trust me, I've got a cure for that. We need to put this into a little context. In early America, physicians bled patients, pharmacists weren't a regulated profession yet, and most people lived far from medical care. So if someone rolled into town selling a tonic that didn't immediately kill you, that was sort of like a strong phase 1 clinical trial.
And that's what I've been doing for the past 30 years.
Before movie theaters, before radios, before Netflix asking if you're still watching, America had medicine shows. These were literally traveling performances that combined entertainment, sales, and a truly sketchy relationship with pharmacology. From the late 1800s into the early 1900s, medicine shows moved from town to town, setting up in public squares, fairgrounds, train depots, anywhere people could gather and be distracted. They were free to attend, which should have been the first warning sign. These shows were amongst the earliest forms of mass entertainment in the United States, especially popular in the South and the West. Long before films and moving images took over, medicine shows were the main event. People came for the music, jokes, the magic tricks, the spectacle. They stayed because someone told them they were probably sick. A medicine show followed a very specific formula. First, you draw a crowd, loud music, comedy, juggling, dramatic storytelling, anything to keep the people watching. Attention was the real currency, and these performers were good at extracting it. Once a crowd was hooked, the show shifted tone. Authority appeared. A performer might put on a white coat, claim medical training, or announce that they had studied under some vague and impressive sounding tradition.
I have an elixir, a tonic, that will cure every conceivable kidney, liver, bladder, and urinary ailment. I have studied the secret ancient and noble Kickapoo Indian acerbal formula.
Credentials were suggested, never confirmed. This was professional legitimacy by costume. Then came the diagnosis phase. The crowd was gentle or not so gently reminded that most of their problems had a name. Bad blood, weak nerves, female troubles, male weakness, general exhaustion from being alive in the 19th century. If you were breathing, you qualified. And finally, the cure was revealed. A single bottle, a miraculous tonic, a secret formula, one product that somehow treated pain, anxiety, fatigue, addiction, moral weakness, and whatever else the crowd seemed worried about that day. No prescription, no dosing instructions, no explanation of how it worked, because that wasn't the point. Planted audience members stepped forward to offer testimonials. They'd been sick. They'd been hopeless. They took the medicine. Now they were cured, revitalized, and even enthusiastic. This was peer-reviewed evidence if you don't review peers very closely. The sales pitch always ended with urgency. Limited supply, special pricing, only available today. The show would be gone by morning. Along with it, any opportunity to ask questions, report side effects, or request a refund.
Step right up! Miracle elixir cures coughs, cramps, cowardice, and possibly bad in-laws. Limited supply once this wagon...
The products themselves were usually tonics, tinctures, or salves. Many were loaded with alcohol. Others contained opium, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, or even mercury. Some produced immediate effects: sedation, stimulation, euphoria, relief. Others produced addiction, toxicity, or slow organ failure. From a pharmacology standpoint, this was polypharmacy without oversight, labeling, or shame. From a business standpoint, it was extremely effective. People bought these medicines because medical care was expensive, inaccessible, or actively harmful. Doctors still used things like bloodletting and purging. Regulation didn't exist, and entertainment lowers skepticism. Desperation also helps. Medicine shows weren't run by clinicians, they were run by entrepreneurs. Their skill wasn't in healing, it was in selling and leaving town quickly. Eventually, the harm became impossible to ignore. Children were dying from opiate syrups, addiction was widespread, fraud was obvious, and public pressure led to laws, labeling requirements, and eventually federal oversight. Medicine shows didn't disappear because science won overnight. They disappeared because the damage piled up. And that's the key point. Medicine shows aren't the reason that pharmacy exists as a profession. They're what happens when drugs are divorced from evidence, oversight, and accountability. They're why we label, study, test, warn, and regulate. So next time you're buried in the mechanisms of action, adverse effects tables, or regulatory compliance, remember the alternative. That alternative was cocaine cough syrup sold by a banjo player in a white coat. So translation to today. This was direct-to-consumer advertising with no prescriber, no pharmacist, and no dosing instructions. Just drink up until hope returns. Now, let's talk about formulation. The active ingredients in patent medicines were not subtle. Ethanol was everywhere, often making up 30 to 50% of the product. That is boozy, like a bottle of Jack Daniels. These weren't gentle elixirs. They were hard liquor with a label and a medical font. If patients reported feeling calmer, less anxious, or suddenly optimistic about life, that wasn't placebo. That was intoxication, doing exactly what it does best. And it wasn't just alcohol. There were opioids, opium, and morphine were common, especially in syrups marketed for pain, cough, diarrhea, and critically, children. Infant soothing syrups routinely contained morphine. Did it work? Babies didn't cry because the medicine worked. They didn't cry because they were sedated. Pain relief, anti-diarrheal properties, cough suppressant. Yeah, it worked. Cocaine showed up as well. Proudly and without apology, it was sold for toothaches, fatigue, low mood, and general weakness. Cocaine toothache drops promised instant relief, which, pharmacologically speaking, was accurate. We often just teach the mechanism of action of cocaine as inhibition of dopamine uptake, but it also produces local anesthetic effects primarily by blocking the voltage-gated sodium channels in nerve cell membranes. They just skip the part about dependence, cardiovascular risk, and what happens when the bottle runs out. Cannabis made frequent appearances too, usually folded into tonics marketed for pain, sleep, and nervous conditions. Again, effects were real, but the important part, so were the risks. None of them were explained. And it gets wilder. And then there was mercury. Yes, mercury included in teething powders and skin preparations, because if the child wasn't already uncomfortable, apparently the solution was neurotoxicity. These products didn't just miss the mark, they actively poisoned the target. More fun, chloroform also found its way into some of these formulations. If you think about OTC drugs today, the multiple combinations of active ingredients, that's sort of what evolved. Each tonic having its own proprietary blend, 5 parts ethanol, 2 parts morphine, 1 part cocaine, and a sprinkle of cannabis for good luck. These weren't just combination products, they were polypharmacy as a worldview. From a modern PharmD perspective, what's most striking isn't just what was in these medicines, it was what was missing. There were no labels. There were, but they didn't say what was in there. They didn't provide important information. So maybe pictures, but no ingredient lists, no contraindications, no pregnancy warnings, no pediatric dosing, no renal adjustments, largely because the kidneys were still more of a suggestion than an organ anyone felt responsible for protecting. Patients had no idea what they were taking and how much they were taking, or what might happen next. And the companies selling these products didn't have to know either. They just needed good marketing and sales pitches, which is why the government eventually had to step in. Not to be bureaucratic, but to be a brake pedal, because when chemistry meets marketing without oversight, that can end badly. One of the most successful and widely sold patent medicines in American history was Lydia E. Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed almost exclusively to women for what were delicately referred to as female complaints. That phrase alone did a lot of work. Female complaints, that wasn't a diagnosis, it was a catch-all. It covered menstrual pain, mood changes, fatigue, anxiety, infertility, menopause, and essentially any distress experienced by women that the 19th century medicine either didn't understand or didn't take seriously. Pinkham's product was sold as a natural herbal remedy, a gentle alternative to aggressive medical treatments of the time. The branding leaned heavily on maternal trust and moral respectability. Lydia Pinkham herself appeared in the advertisements as a kindly, competent woman offering guidance when male physicians failed to listen. And then there was the formulation. The key active ingredient in Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was alcohol in significant amounts. So when women reported feeling calmer after taking it, that wasn't surprising. When they reported feeling happier, less distressed, more able to cope, that also made sense. From a pharmacologic perspective, this was exactly what you'd expect. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It produces anxiolysis. It reduces inhibition. It temporarily blunts emotional pain. It creates a short-term sense of relief, especially in people experiencing chronic stress, social constraint, and untreated mental health symptoms. In other words, the medicine worked, just not in the way the advertisements implied. This wasn't targeted treatment for gynecologic or endocrine conditions. It was chemical sedation packaged as empowerment. And importantly, it was legal, socially acceptable, and marketed as medicine at a time when women's emotional suffering was routinely dismissed. So Pinkham's compound didn't solve the underlying problem, but it did offer temporary relief in a system that offered very little else. From a modern pharmacy perspective, this is a case study in how subjective symptoms improvement can be pharmacologically real while clinically misleading. Patients feel better. The mechanism was clear. The indication was not. So when we say this product was successful, we don't mean it cured disease. We mean it met a market demand created by neglect, which leads to the uncomfortable but accurate summary. This wasn't women's health. It was day drinking with branding, and it worked until regulation, labeling, and actual science forced medicine to do better. By the late 1800s, patent medicine claims had completely detached from reality. These products didn't just promise relief, they promised cures, bold ones, absolute ones. Medicines claimed to cure tuberculosis at a time when TB was one of the leading causes of death in the United States. They claimed to cure cancer decades before oncology had any meaningful tools to treat it. They claimed to cure addiction, often while containing the very substances people were addicted to. They also promised to cure nervous weakness, a diagnosis so vague it could apply to anxiety, depression, exhaustion, or simply being overwhelmed by industrialized society. And in perhaps the most ambitious claim of all, some products promise to cure moral failure. Because if you could sell ethics in a bottle, you absolutely would. So what these products did not have were clinical trials. There were no controlled studies, no comparison groups, no standardized dosing, and no measurable outcomes. There was no concept of efficacy beyond whether someone said they felt better afterwards. I have to comment, a lot of this is reminiscent of what my current Facebook newsfeed looks like. Evidence consisted almost entirely of testimonials, often paid, staged or written by the manufacturers themselves. A neighbor's cousin's uncle felt better, therefore science. Before and after stories replaced data. Confidence replaced proof. From a modern pharmacy perspective, this wasn't evidence-based medicine. It wasn't even evidence-adjacent medicine. It was storytelling with bottles. And the system worked because humans are wired to trust narratives more than statistics, especially when they're desperate, sick, or frightened. If someone with tuberculosis felt a burst of energy after taking an alcohol or cocaine-based tonic, that subjective improvement was framed as healing. Remember, most of these active ingredients also caused withdrawal. When symptoms returned, the solution was more product. Anecdote proved to be an extremely efficient way to sell ineffective and often harmful drugs. So when you hear a confident claim with no data behind it, remember this hot take. If anecdotal evidence cured disease, pharmacy school wouldn't exist. It would just be a podcast. To understand why patent medicines dominated American healthcare for so long, you have to follow the money. By the late 19th century, patent medicines were not a fringe hustle out of the back of a horse-drawn wagon or a collection of shady back alley sellers. They were one of the largest consumer industries in the United States. By the 1880s and 1890s, estimates suggest Americans were spending hundreds of millions of dollars per year on patent medicines. In some years, the total revenue approached or exceeded 1% of the entire U.S. gross national product. For context, that is an extraordinary figure. Adjusted for inflation, historians estimate that the patent medicine industry would be worth tens of billions of dollars annually in today's terms. This was not pocket change. This was a mature national market with manufacturing plants, distribution networks, sales teams, and massive advertising budgets. Some individual companies were pulling in millions of dollars per year at a time when the average worker earned a few $100s annually. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound alone sold millions of bottles and became one of the most recognizable consumer brands in the country. Other companies blanketed newspapers, magazines, barns, fences, and buildings with ads. At one point, patent medicine advertisement accounted for a substantial portion of all newspaper revenue in the United States. That matters because it meant the press had a financial incentive not to criticize the industry. Does that remind you of anything today? How about Anderson Cooper 360, brought to you by Pfizer? Medicine shows, free samples, mail order sales, and national advertising campaigns all fed into a system where profit scaled quickly and accountability didn't scale at all. These products were cheap to produce, expensive to market, and endlessly repeatable. Alcohol, opium, and plant extracts cost very little compared to the price of the bottle and the promise that was printed on the label. From a business standpoint, this was a near perfect model. High margins, recurring customers, no clinical trials, no regulatory delays, no requirement to prove anything worked. And when people became addicted, dependent, had withdrawal, or were chronically ill, that wasn't a failure of the product. That was customer retention. This is also why regulation didn't arrive easily or quickly. The patent medicine industry didn't just sell drugs, it funded newspapers, sponsored events, employed tens of thousands of people, and embedded itself deeply in the American economy. When early reformers pushed for labeling laws and oversight, they weren't fighting misinformation alone, they were fighting one of the most profitable consumer industries of the era. So when the Pure Food and Drug Act finally passed in 1906, it wasn't because companies suddenly developed ethics, it was because the harm became so visible. And the deception was undeniable. The public pressure finally outweighed profit. So how dangerous were patent medicines? And how many people died? The uncomfortable truth is this. We don't know how many people died from patent medicines. And that uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was no systematic way to track adverse drug events. Drug death certificates were inconsistent. Toxicology was primitive. Addiction, overdose, and organ failure were rarely attributed to medicine at all. They were blamed on weakness, bad blood, moral failure, or fate. So when we ask how dangerous patent medicines were, we're not asking for a clean number. We're asking for how much harm can occur when drugs are powerful, unregulated, and aggressively marketed. The answer is a lot of people. So let's start with what we know for certain. Patent medicines were routinely contained substances that modern pharmacy recognized as high risk. Morphine, opium, cocaine, alcohol at intoxicating levels, mercury, chloroform. These weren't trace contaminants, they were active ingredients, often undisclosed and inconsistently dosed. Children were especially vulnerable. Infant soothing syrups commonly contained morphine. Teething powders contained mercury. Babies died from respiratory depression, seizures, and toxicity. But those deaths were rarely recorded as drug related. They were listed as failure to thrive, convulsions, or sudden illness. Historians can document thousands of confirmed deaths tied directly to specific products once scrutiny began in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But those are just the cases that were obvious enough to be noticed and investigated. Most were not. Addiction vastly expanded the harm. Widespread opioid dependence in the late 19th century, especially among women, was driven largely by patent medicines. Addiction itself was not counted as harm. Overdose deaths were misclassified. Long-term complications were invisible to public health accounting. Mercury-containing products caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Cocaine tonics led to cardiovascular events, psychosis, and fatal overdoses. Alcohol-heavy medicines contributed to liver disease and poisoning while being socially protected by the label medicine. From a modern pharmacy perspective, this was not a handful of tragic events. This was population-level exposure to uncontrolled pharmacology. Some historians estimate that tens of thousands of deaths occurred over the patent medicine era that can be plausibly attributed to these products. Others argue the number is far higher, but cannot be responsibly quantified because the data simply do not exist. And that is the key point. The danger of patent medicines wasn't just that they killed people, it's that they killed people quietly. There were no adverse event reporting systems, no post-marketing surveillance, no requirements to link cause and effect. Harm blended into the background of everyday life. This is why the creation of labeling laws, toxicity standards, and eventually the Food and Drug Administration wasn't bureaucratic overreach. It was a response to a body count that could no longer be ignored. When we talk about how dangerous patent medicines were, it helps to move from abstractions to actual cases. Because once you look at what happened to real people, the need for regulation stops feeling theoretical. Let's start with infants. One of the most infamous products of the era was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was marketed to parents as a safe, gentle remedy for teething and infant fussiness. The label promised calm, sleep, and relief. The active ingredient was morphine. Infants who received the syrup often stopped crying. Parents thought the medicine worked. In reality, the babies were experiencing opioid-induced respiratory depression. Some survived, but many did not. By the late 19th century, medical journals were documenting cases of infants dying after repeated doses. These deaths were often recorded as convulsions, or again, failure to thrive, not overdose, because no one wanted to believe a medicine sold for babies was the cause. Next, mercury. Teething powders marketed under names like Dr. Moffat's teething powder contained calomel, a mercury compound. These powders were rubbed directly into infant gums. Children developed symptoms we now recognize clearly: excessive salivation, mouth ulcers, neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. At the time, this cluster of symptoms was called Pink's disease. It took a decade to link it definitively to mercury exposure from teething remedies. Entire cohorts of children were poisoned before the connection was widely accepted. So, again, when we ask how dangerous were patent medicines, the most accurate answer is this: they were dangerous enough to force the United States to reinvent medicine, pharmacy, and regulation from the ground up. And when we ask how many people died, the honest answer is enough that no one wanted to just keep on not counting. In 1906, something finally snapped. After decades of death, addiction, fraud, and public outrage, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. This law didn't appear because industry had a moral awakening. It appeared because the damage had become too visible to ignore. For the first time in the United States history, the federal government said, you cannot just sell mystery chemicals and call it medicine. Under the 1906 law, certain things became mandatory. Manufacturers now had to list specific ingredients. Not all of them, but the ones lawmakers were most worried about: alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, and a few other substances had to be disclosed on the label. Consumers were finally allowed to know if their tonic was actually liquor with opioids. Dangerous substances didn't have to be removed, but they did have to be admitted. That alone was a seismic shift. The law also restricted fraudulent labeling. Companies could no longer outright lie about what was in the bottle or deliberately misrepresent the nature of the product. You couldn't claim a product was free of narcotics if it absolutely was not. This seems obvious now. At the time, it was radical. And from this law grew the regulatory infrastructure that would eventually become the Food and Drug Administration, an agency whose original job was not to approve drugs, but stop the most egregious deception. Now, here's the part that a pharmacy student might need to hear clearly. That 1906 Act did not require drugs to be effective. Read that again. Drugs did not have to work. They did not have to cure anything. They did not have to improve outcomes. They just had to be honest in labeling. If your product contained alcohol, opium, and mercury, that was legally fine as long as you said so on the label. If it failed to treat tuberculosis, cancer, or addiction, that was also fine as long as you didn't lie too creatively about it. From a modern pharmacy perspective, this feels absurd. But historically, this law wasn't about optimizing care. It was about stopping silent poisoning. The federal government's first priority was not efficacy, it was visibility. You can't regulate what you can't see. You can't study what you can't name. And you can't protect patients if no one knows what they're swallowing. So, yes, by today's standards, this was a very low bar, but it was the first bar. Later, laws would add requirements for safety testing, then proof of efficacy, then controlled trials, then post-marketing surveillance, then adverse event reporting, then the regulatory maze that you are currently living in. All of that exists because this law established a basic principle. Medicine should not be secret. So when people complain that regulation slows innovation, that might be true. But remember where innovation was moving at full speed in 1905. And remember this uncomfortable truth: efficacy was optional. So why does this matter? Like for a pharmacist, pharmacy didn't emerge just to control drugs. It emerged because somebody had to understand drugs. Somebody had to check claims. Somebody had to stop people from selling mercury smoothies. Modern pharmacy exists because unregulated medicine harmed patients. Advertising outpaced science, and chemistry eventually demanded professional supervision. So, congratulations, pharmacists. You are the adult supervision. Maybe you're a pharmacy student that's buried in mechanisms of action, PK curves, labeling requirements, REMS programs. Just remember, the alternative to that was cocaine cough syrup sold by a banjo player out of a wagon.
Step right up, folks. Guaranteed cure for toothaches, headaches, and whatever else ails y'all. Only 15 cents a bottle.
What actually happened after 1906? The Pure Food and Drug Act did not instantly create the modern regulatory system, but it created the foundation. The law was enforced at that time by the Bureau of Chemistry within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That bureau, led by chemist Harvey Wiley, began testing products, seizing misbranded drugs, and bringing enforcement actions. For the first time, the federal government was actively analyzing what was inside medicines being sold to the public. That Bureau of Chemistry eventually evolved into the modern Food and Drug Administration. The FDA did not begin as a powerful approval agency. It began as a labeling police force. Its original mission was simple: identify what's in the bottle, stop the most obvious fraud, expose the worst deception. That may sound modest, but it fundamentally changed American medicine. Once ingredients had to be disclosed, chemistry became central. Once chemistry became central, pharmacists became indispensable. But the 1906 Act was only the first step. In 1938, after a drug called elixir sulfanilamide killed over 100 people, many of them children, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act required manufacturers to prove safety before marketing drugs. In 1962, after the thalidomide disaster abroad, new amendments required proof of efficacy through well-controlled clinical trials. And over decades, the regulatory system expanded into manufacturing standards, post-marketing surveillance, risk evaluation programs, and pharmacovigilance. Each new layer of regulation expanded the professional scope of pharmacy. Originally, pharmacists compounded raw ingredients. Then they became dispensers of manufactured products, then medication experts, then clinical decision makers. Today, pharmacists interpret trial data, evaluate safety signals, manage chronic disease states, and in some states, even prescribe and participate directly in regulatory science. The field evolved because drugs became more powerful and because history showed what happens when power outruns oversight. Pharmacy's origins are rooted in control, measuring, standardizing, verifying. The patent medicine era exposed what happens when drugs are marketed without evidence. The 1906 Acts exposed what happens when transparency becomes law. The FDA institutionalized oversight, and pharmacy grew alongside that oversight. First as the technical expert, then as the medication authority, and now as the clinical partner in patient care. Modern pharmacy did not appear fully formed. It was built in response to harm, built in response to deception, built in response to thousands of quiet, uncounted injuries that force society to admit that chemistry is not neutral. It requires stewardship. So when you look at the regulatory landscape today, the clinical trials, REMS programs, labeling standards, knowing pharmacokinetics, adverse event reporting, you are looking at the accumulated memory of a century of mistakes. It was medicine without accountability. The Pure Food and Drugs Act was accountability without efficacy. The modern FDA is accountability with evidence. And pharmacy is a profession that translates that evidence into care. That's how we got here. Not through smooth progress, but through correction. And that's a good lesson on the balance between regulation and innovation. Regulation isn't always the enemy of innovation. Sometimes it's the reason patients survive innovation. So thanks for viewing. Like, subscribe, and maybe comment with the most unhinged supplement claim you've seen, because the patent medicine era never really ended. Now it's just moved online.